from the shores of beautiful Lake Coeur d'Alene in the heart of North Idaho. Local, regional, national, and international guests discuss their topics on our forum, the North Idaho College Public Forum. With your host and moderator, political scientist, Tony Stewart.
I welcome you to our continuing series that's titled A Journey Through 20th Century America. On today's program, we have the privilege of having two very famous people in history to have a conversation with President Theodore Roosevelt, who was the 26th President of the United States and lived from 1858 until 1919. Mr. President, welcome to the program. We're pleased that you will come from your time to our time to have this conversation on our series of Journey Through 20th Century America.
Thank you, Tony. Glad to be here.
And I'm equally pleased to welcome to the program our second guest, and that is Congresswoman Bella Abzug, who was a congresswoman from New York from 1971 until 1977. She lived from 1920 until 1998. Congresswoman, welcome to our program. It's a pleasure to have you to come to our time. Although you lived through much of the century, welcome back in the year 2000.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
And as always, I'm pleased to have our two regular panelists, Janelle Burke, who is an attorney in the state of Idaho, and next to her is Steve Schenck, who is the Vice President of College Relations and Development at North Idaho College. And Janelle, I will turn over our distinguished guest to you to start our questioning.
I'll begin the questioning with President Roosevelt. President Theodore Roosevelt, what would you most like to be remembered for? What would you want us to remember about you?
I think the thing that I would most like people to remember me for was my dedication to serving what is usually called the common man, because at the time that I was president, this was a very, very important thing to happen at that time, because we had the industrialists at the time who were really not greatly concerned, in my opinion, about the common people in this country. And I think my defense of them is the thing that I would like to be remembered for most.
Now, Congresswoman Bella Abzug, you also had contributions that you made. What would you most like to be remembered for? What do you consider your greatest contributions?
I would like to be remembered for being for the rights of women and all people, and especially for the importance of preserving our environment and keeping the world a safe place to live. During the latter portion of my life, I worked unceasingly with the United Nations in order to accomplish that.
And in that way, you sort of have something in common with President Roosevelt. He too worked for the environment in some very special ways. I believe you were involved in the parks system.
Actually, I actually formed the first world's national park when I had the area of Yellowstone set aside for a park, which has been, I think, of tremendous value to the people. Today, as you're probably aware, there's more than 1 million people a year that go to Yellowstone, and it was the first one in the world, not just in our country, but in the world. And I'm very proud of that.
Thank you.
Steve Schenck.
I'm going to start with Congresswoman Abzug, and it's a pleasure on these shows as we reach back into history. I don't often get to interview someone who truly was a contemporary. Certainly, I grew up watching at least a part of your career, and yet I don't know as much about you as I would like to. Could you tell us a little bit about your life before 1971 when you were elected to Congress?
Well, yes, I graduated from Columbia Law School. At the time, Harvard was not accepting women, so that's why I didn't go to Harvard. I met my husband, Martin, about the same time I graduated with my undergraduate degree, and then he and I courted during the war, went on to get married in 1947, and had 2 children. I worked as a lawyer for 20 years nearly before I became a congresswoman. I mainly represented civil rights, and I also represented indigent black people in the South. As a matter of fact, I recall during my second pregnancy, I went to Alabama, and no hotel would give me a room because I was there to make an appeal for Willie McGee, a black man who had been convicted of raping a white woman. And I lost the appeal, he was executed, and I lost the baby.
From what you've told us so far, it sounds like you had no political experience prior to running for the U.S. Congress. Is that correct? Or did you serve in the state legislature or any local capacity in politics?
I was president of my student council in school. I was president of my class when I was a freshman. I helped our mayor, the mayor of New York, in his campaign, and then I was quite miffed with him when he wouldn't even give me a political appointment after all the work I'd done for him. And I thought, well, I'll run for Congress and see what I can do. And I ran on the platform that this woman's place is in the House of Representatives, and I won.
Do you think it was a bit extraordinary to go from no political experience to national office in, well, at that time, New York might still have been the most populous state in the Union?
I was for the common people, and they knew it. And they were used to me campaigning and working in political campaigns in New York, and I think they were ready for a woman in the House of Representatives. I was one of 9 women in the House at the time I was elected.
Thank you very much. And President Roosevelt, to me, you're one of the most fascinating characters in American political history. And yet again, not being a very good historian, I know a fair amount about you from the time of your presidency, but very little about you before that time. Could you give us a little overview of your history?
Well, I was born in New York City, and my father was from an old Dutch family, and a rather wealthy family. I was born into a rather wealth, and my mother was Martha Bullock, who was from the state of Georgia, and she was of Scotch-Irish and Huguenot descent, which made me then probably a pretty typical American, that I was a mixed pedigree. And I attended Harvard College. I was a sickly child when I was small, and I spent much time exercising my body and building myself up to the extent of overcoming my deficiencies. I attended Harvard College, where I graduated, and then I enrolled at Columbia University in the law school. But I was more interested in writing. I had written since I learned to write. I was very interested in history. I did a lot of historical writing, and I was also became interested in politics at an early age. I was elected to the New York State Assembly at the age of 23, where I very quickly incurred the wrath of the party bosses because of my hard-headedness and stubbornness. And at that time, both major parties, were controlled by party bosses who decided who was going to run and who was not going to run. And they after I was elected, they were not too pleased with me as a politician.
And you were something of a political renegade for most of your life, weren't you?
Yes, I was. Yes. As a matter of fact, when I returned from Cuba, which I had gained quite a considerable amount of fame because of the well-known correspondent Richard Harding Davis, who was one of the major correspondents of the time, had written a number of articles about my exploits at the charge of San Juan Hill and so on. And
Rough Riders.
And the Rough Riders, yes. And when I returned, the people wanted me to run for governor of the state of New York, but the party bosses did not want me to. And there was a controversy, but because of the publicity I had received, they could not very well deny that. So I was allowed to run for a 2-year term for governor. When the term was up, they did not want me to run. I really incurred their wrath while I was governor also. They did not want me to run again, and as a result, they almost maneuvered me into running as vice president, which at that time was a non-entity office. No one wanted to be vice president because the vice president did nothing. So they encouraged me to run for this office, and it was only to try to quieten me down, but by jingo, they didn't do it because I still spoke out. I still incurred their wrath, and I still was not popular with them. But I was popular with the people because the people were the ones that I really was next to. They're the ones that I supported. And as a result of that, if they had known what was going to happen, they would never have made me vice president. You can rest assured of that. But when it did come about, then I was really still not very popular with the party bosses, simply because that I took the part of the people. One of the first things that I did when I became president was that the coal miners were on strike. And at that time, coal was the lifeblood of this country. And the coal miners were asking for raise in wages, which I thought they should have. The operators would not even negotiate with them. They would not talk to them. So I took the part of the coal miners, and I fought them to a standstill, and by jingo, we won.
Thank you, Mr. President.
Mr. President and Congresswoman, you have so much in common, and our panel has alluded to that on a couple of occasions today. You both were outspoken. You both challenged a lot of your party leaders. You both had, as we've seen, a very strong following at your base with the population. And so, Mr. President, for example, in addition to what you've already indicated about your interest in the environment, the national parks, and workers, you also was known as the Trust Buster, and you wanted certain kind of legislation that would address some of the economic powers of the time. And Congresswoman, you not only was upset with some of the political leaders in your state, but you really shook up the House when you arrived, and you demanded change, not only in the operation of the House, but the role of women and civil rights and minorities. So I say all that to say this to both of you. And Congresswoman, I shall start with you. If I may call you Bella, that's what you're best known for. That's a name. What is there about people like you and the President, Mr. Roosevelt, that gives you the inner strength, the courage, and a lot of fortitude and determination to really, I'm sure, do things that are very stressful and angers some people within the society? Where does that come from? What makes you stand out as a pioneer in change? Throughout this whole series that we're doing, we've had a number of people. Some are conservative, some are liberal, some are Republicans, some are Democrats, some are not political at all. They all had that one thing in common. They were determined there would be change.
I was the daughter of Russian Jewish immigrants. I had a sister. There were no brothers. When my father died when I was 13 years old, I went to ask if I could say Kaddish for my father, and I was allowed permission, although it was typically the male member of the family who said those prayers for the dead, and every year I prayed. My mother believed that every person had something of worth to give. She believed that I could do anything, that my sister could do anything, and we did. When they began above-ground nuclear testing of the bomb in 1961, I organized Women's Strike for Peace against testing of the bomb and against the war in Vietnam. My first day in Congress, I introduced a bill to end the war in Vietnam. I was the first person in the House to speak for the impeachment of Richard M. Nixon. I was responsible in the committee to organize and put through the Sunshine Law or Freedom of Information Act to stop some of the shady business going on with covert activities by our government.
So what we see here in both of you, you both in your time were restless. You were initiating on controversial issues a demand for addressing those. But I hear you saying that you had a lot that came from your family. You had a lot of self-esteem, and so was that part of the key to your willingness to crusade?
It was indeed. That and the support also of my husband, who always encouraged me to follow my heart and my convictions and was supportive of me every day of our marriage.
Ms. President, you've heard what our other guest has had to say about how she shook up the system. You've even showed it here emotionally today on our program. Would you share with us, too, where your strength came from? And you really came from a very prominent family, and another one of your family would become president later, Franklin D. Roosevelt. But you do stand out. And may I just add one other thing in your answering that question, and that is what I find remarkable, even after you're president, when you went to Africa and on your safaris, and that you were very tough, even though you might have been somewhat fragile when you were a youth. And I understand that you were in the Midwest giving a speech and you got shot and you finished your speech. You were very physically tough, as well as your inner strength.
Well, that is quite true, but I think I inherited this from my father. As I said before, I was sickly when I was a child, and my father was a very dedicated father. He was actually he was my hero. All of my life that I remembered my father as being one of the greatest people that I had ever known. Now, my father had inherited the family business along with his brothers, my uncles, but he didn't take a great deal of interest in the business as much as he did in charitable work in New York City, which at that time, as we're all aware, had a great population of poor. And my father was one of the leaders in taking part in trying to relieve these poor people of some of their misery. And then, because I was a sickly child, he supported me in all of my efforts to build myself up. As a matter of fact, when I was about 10 or 11 years old, he bought me a pair of boxing gloves and gave them to me as part of my exercises that I took. And then everything, but my father, unfortunately, my father died when I was rather young.
But still, you had this impact here.
But I think that I inherited this from him. I got this from him. And this was one of the reasons I think that it was all of my life that I was interested in the common people, the people who needed help. Yeah. It was my theory that those people who were already on top didn't need help. Okay. They already had help.
Thank you, Mr. President. I see in both of you family roots, and that's what I was trying to get at. One more question, I'll go back to the panel. Congresswoman Abzug, I have to ask about why you became famous for your symbol being your hat.
Well, a lot of my detractors claim that I wear these hats in order to attract attention to myself, and it certainly does that. But when I first began practicing law, there were very few women lawyers, so I wore a hat in order for the judge and the other lawyers to realize that I was a practicing woman lawyer and not a secretary.
Thank you. Janelle Burke.
Each of you were involved during your lifetime in a war in some aspect, in some way. President Roosevelt, let's start with you. What effect did the war have on you? Explain what you did, what your role was, and what effect that had on your later career.
Well, as you probably know, that I spent a considerable amount of time in the Dakota Territory in my younger life. And I learned a lot from the people in that area because they were pioneers. They were rugged people. And I often wondered if under duress, if under stress, how I would hold up as a person. I think this is something that all of us wonder about at some time. What would we do in such a situation? And when the war of the Spanish-American War came along, and I organized the first volunteer cavalry, which was known as the Rough Riders, became known as the Rough Riders. Then when we made the charge, which was the famous thing in that battle was the charge of San Juan Hill, and when we made that charge, and the and it was not actually, there was two hills there. One was Kettle Hill and one was San Juan Hill, and we were trying to take the fort at Santiago, Cuba, which of course was fortified by the Spanish army. And when we made the charge, I was given the task of securing Kettle Hill, which the name came about because our soldiers had found a huge sugar kettle that they used for making sugar, and they called it Kettle Hill. Well, we went up Kettle Hill and secured that without too much effort. When we got up to the top, the Spaniards, seeing that they were outnumbered, they ran away, they retreated. I looked over at San Juan Hill and saw that they were, it was pretty well fortified. I had come up to a fence on Kettle Hill, and I had to get off my horse, and I ran across, I ordered my men to go over to San Juan Hill. Apparently, in the noise of the battle, they didn't hear me. I ran about maybe 50, 75 yards, turned around, and there was no one behind me. I ran back and repeated the order, and this time they followed me, and we made the charge of San Juan Hill, which was well fortified. And we did this under the hail of battle.
And from that point, you became famous for that.
I became famous for that.
We're running out of time. We need to get the Congresswoman's statement, and then we'll. Because I do want to introduce who you are before we're up.
Just a quick statement about your involvement in the Vietnam War.
That really came about because of my father's example again. He managed a meat market in Hell's Kitchen portion of New York to protest the First World War. He renamed that the Live and Let Live Meat Market. And then I saw the effect it had upon my dear husband when he was in the Second World War. And
you became a pacifist.
I was a pacifist, but a very active one.
I want to finish our round, then we'll come back to introduce you up at Steve Sheik. We have time for a couple of questions from you.
Quickly, Congresswoman, I'll continue with you. Would you say that that your style was combative when you were in Congress?
I saw that things needed to be done, and they weren't being done quickly enough. I saw a lot of the common people suffering, especially during the McCarthy era, again, result of the war, about government hiding of what was going on. I think that came to its culmination during the Nixon years when we realized how terrible it was to hide information from the public. We had a right to know.
And Mr. President, after Tony's question, I just have to know who shot you and why, and what speech were you giving when that happened?
I was making a speech at Minneapolis, and who shot me, I'm not sure who it was. I never knew. Fortunately, I had placed a book in my coat pocket, and the bullet did strike that, and it did penetrate, but my body, but it didn't reach a vital spot. So most of the people in the audience didn't realize that I had been shot until after it was over, and I was then taken to the hospital, but the bullet had not penetrated deep enough to cause any great concern, although I was bleeding at the time, but not enough for the public to know.
Certainly
this
not
event.
enough to interrupt a good speech.
Thank you.
Thank
Don.
you.
On that note, we're going to change format just a little bit. Ladies and gentlemen, our viewers, I do want to introduce the two individuals that have done such a wonderful job, both on our program and here at the forum, to the public, portraying these two famous people. First of all, portraying President Theodore Roosevelt is our friend Hugh Smith.
Thank you, Don.
Hugh Smith is a graduate of North Idaho College and Lewis Clark State College. And Hugh, it's always a pleasure to have you. This is not the first character that you've played for us, and so we thank you for taking time. And there's months of preparation for this, and we want to really thank you for that. And our second individual is a fellow, one of our employees at North Idaho College, a colleague, and that is Linda Erickson. Linda is in the English and Foreign Languages Department, where she's the secretary. And Linda, you've played someone, I believe, almost every year since we started this format 5 years ago. And both of you are just wonderful at doing this, and we thank you. And Linda, she not only plays these different roles, but she's a member of the committee, what we call the North Idaho College Popcorn Forum Committee. Let me just ask in a little less than a minute, so we get about 30 seconds. Playing these roles, what has it meant to you, Linda?
It's certainly introduced me to people who were admirable, who carried on in the face of great odds. In the past, I'd portrayed women who were only famous because they were infamous in long ago history. Otherwise, we never would have heard about them.
Right. And Hugh, what has it meant to you to play these different characters?
Well, as you know, Tony, since I graduated from North Idaho College, I've been active in the college itself in various ways. And this was one of the things that I enjoyed doing as a participant in college activities. And but I don't think that you, who assigned this position to me as Franklin Roosevelt, as Theodore Roosevelt, could have picked a person that I would have enjoyed portraying more than Roosevelt.
On that note, I'd bring the conclusion. The problem on this show is we run out of time with the clock, but thank you both. It's been a wonderful enjoyment having you here. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm sure that you've had a treat that's been equal to ours to listen to our two friends portray President Teddy Roosevelt and Congresswoman Bella Abzug. I want to inform you that we will continue this series again next week when we journey through 20th century America, and at the next program we'll be interviewing 3 other famous people in history. Until then, please have a good week. I am Tony Stewart.
North Idaho College Public Forum is the longest-running public television show of its type in North America and is seen in 7 states and 2 Canadian provinces. Each episode is pre-recorded live and is an educational community outreach from North Idaho College. Please join us again at this same time next week for another new edition of North Idaho College Public Forum on this public television station.